I was standing at the security checkpoint in Paris when my white brother-in-law shoved his heavy designer duffel bag into my hands. Seconds later, armed customs agents swarmed me, unzipping the bag to reveal stacks of smuggled cash. Instead of clearing my name, my mother reached across the conveyor belt and snatched my purse, stealing my passport and my phone. "We cannot miss your sister's vow renewal over your careless mistakes," she hissed, walking away to leave me stranded in a foreign country. As I sat in a windowless detention room facing international federal charges, the heavy metal door swung open. A billionaire I knew from my past leaned in and whispered, "Pretend you are with me. My jet is waiting. Trust me, they will regret this. If you have ever been sacrificed by the people who were supposed to protect you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe because you will want to see exactly what happened when I crashed their $1 million party in Monaco." The air inside Charles de Gaulle Airport was stifling, but the sweat beading on Trent's pale forehead had nothing to do with the temperature. My brother-in-law kept shifting his weight from one expensive Italian loafer to the other, his eyes darting frantically toward the French customs agents screening passengers ahead of us. We were supposed to be transferring to a short flight to Monaco for his and my sister Jasmine's extravagant 5-year vow renewal. The entire trip was an exercise in extreme vanity, bankrolled by the illusion of their massive wealth and my parents' desperate need to project absolute perfection to their elite social circles back home in Atlanta. "Hold this," Trent suddenly muttered, shoving his black leather carry-on directly against my chest. His fingers were shaking as he fumbled with his wrist. My Rolex is unclasped. The pin is stuck. I barely had time to grip the leather handles before a sharp whistle pierced the air. 2 French customs officers abandoned their posts at the X-ray monitors and marched directly toward us. They pointed at the bag in my hands, issuing rapid, aggressive commands in French. I do not speak French, but the universal language of airport security made their intentions perfectly clear. They wanted the bag on the metal table. Now. I turned to Trent, expecting him to step forward and claim his luggage. Instead, he took 2 large steps backward, physically putting me between himself and the armed officers. One of the guards grabbed the bag from my hands, slammed it onto the inspection table, and yanked the heavy zipper open. My breath caught in my throat. The bag was not filled with clothes or toiletries. It was packed to the brim with tight, thick bundles of euros, hundreds of thousands of them bound in rubber bands entirely undeclared. "What is this?" I demanded, whipping my head around to look at Trent. "Trent, tell them this is your bag." Trent held his hands up in a gesture of complete innocence, his blue eyes wide with manufactured panic. "I have never seen that bag before in my life, Camille. I do not know what you are trying to pull, but you are not dragging me into it." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his lie, my mother Valerie pushed her way through the growing crowd of onlookers. She had spent the entire morning obsessing over her appearance, terrified that the other wealthy African-American families attending the vow renewal would judge her travel attire. Now she was staring at the stacks of illicit cash with cold, calculating eyes. She did not look shocked. She looked annoyed at the inconvenience. "Mom, tell them," I pleaded, my voice rising in panic as one of the guards unclipped a pair of heavy metal handcuffs from his belt. "Tell them Trent just handed this to me." My mother did not answer me. Instead, her hand shot out across the stainless steel conveyor belt. She did not reach for the duffel bag. She reached for my open tote bag sitting on the rollers. In one swift, practiced motion, she pulled out my navy blue passport holder, which also contained my cell phone and my primary credit cards, and slipped it directly into her own designer handbag. "Mom, what are you doing?" I yelled, lunging forward, but the customs officer immediately shoved me back, shouting a warning. Valerie looked me dead in the eye, her expression entirely devoid of maternal affection. "We cannot miss Jasmine's vow renewal over your careless mistakes, Camille. The entire Jack and Jill Regional Board is waiting for us in Monte Carlo. Do you have any idea how much money your father and I spent to secure this venue? We are not letting you ruin our family's reputation today." "It is his money," I screamed, pointing furiously at Trent, who was already shuffling toward the first-class priority lane. My sister Jasmine finally stepped forward, flipping her perfectly laid hair over her shoulder. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the harsh airport lighting as she crossed her arms. "You are 35 and unmarried, Camille. You have nothing holding you down. Trent is a managing director at a major finance firm. If he gets detained, it makes the news. It ruins everything. The least you can do is take the hit so I can secure this family's legacy. Just cooperate with them and stop embarrassing us in public." I stared at the three of them, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. My father, Elias, the esteemed pastor of one of the largest megachurches in the South, was standing a few feet away, entirely silent. The man who preached every Sunday about family loyalty and divine protection simply looked down at his polished shoes, refusing to meet my gaze. He was letting them sacrifice me to protect the white son-in-law who gave them access to a different tier of wealth. "I am not taking the fall for a federal crime," I shouted, struggling as the customs officer grabbed my wrists and forced them behind my back. "Dad, do something." Elias finally looked up, his face an impenetrable mask. "The Lord tests us in mysterious ways, Camille. We will pray for your safe return." With that, my father turned his back on me. My mother adjusted her blazer, linked her arm through Trent's, and the four of them literally speed-walked away toward their boarding gate. They did not look back, not once. The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped shut around my wrists, biting into my skin as I was hauled away through a maze of sterile white corridors, completely stripped of my identification, my phone, and my family. The detention room was an absolute nightmare of concrete blocks, harsh fluorescent lights, and complete isolation. I was shoved into a hard metal chair bolted to the floor. For 2 agonizing hours, a French investigator interrogated me in broken English. He slammed photographs of the bundled euros onto the table, demanding to know the source of the funds, the intended destination, and the names of my co-conspirators. "I have no identification because my mother stole it," I repeated for the 5th time, my throat raw and aching. "The bag belongs to Trent. He is a financial director. Check the airport security cameras. You will see him hand it to me exactly 10 seconds before your officers approached." The investigator laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "We have checked the cameras, mademoiselle. There is a convenient blind spot right where you were standing. As far as the French government is concerned, you are an undocumented foreign national attempting to smuggle €500,000 across international borders. You are looking at 10 years in a federal facility." The sheer terror of my reality began to crush my chest. I was a crisis management consultant. I spent my life fixing disasters for high net worth clients, pulling politicians and executives out of the fire. But sitting in that freezing room, completely cut off from my resources, I had no strategy. My family had executed a perfect, calculated betrayal. They knew I was the scapegoat. They knew Trent was hiding something, and they chose him over their own flesh and blood to protect their aesthetic. The heavy metal door lock suddenly clicked. The investigator frowned, turning around as the heavy door swung open. The man who stepped into the interrogation room commanded the space instantly. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that screamed quiet wealth, his posture radiating absolute authority. It was Isaiah. We had crossed paths 3 years ago when his massive tech conglomerate was on the verge of a catastrophic public relations collapse. I had worked shadow hours off the books to untangle the mess and save his company's stock from plummeting. I never asked for public credit, and he had always respected my discretion. Isaiah did not look at me immediately. He approached the French investigator and spoke in a rapid, commanding stream of flawless French. The investigator stood up, his arrogant demeanor instantly dissolving into nervous compliance. Isaiah pulled a leather wallet from his jacket and slid a laminated diplomatic tier security clearance badge across the table. The investigator examined it, visibly paled, and immediately stepped back, unlocking my handcuffs with trembling hands. Isaiah turned to me, his dark eyes entirely unreadable to the guards but holding a dangerous, calculating fire. He leaned down, placing his hands on the table, bringing his face mere inches from mine. His breath grazed my ear. "Pretend you are with me. My jet is waiting on the private tarmac. Trust me, Camille. They will regret this." I rubbed my bruised wrists, standing up slowly. The French authorities did not say another word as Isaiah placed a protective hand on the small of my back and guided me out of the detention room. We walked through a series of restricted access hallways, bypassing the chaotic public terminals entirely. The transition from a helpless prisoner to a protected VIP was dizzying, but I forced my mind to sharpen. The shock was fading. The fury was taking over. The crisp evening air hit my face as we stepped out onto the private tarmac. A massive, sleek private jet sat waiting, its engines already humming. Isaiah did not offer me meaningless platitudes or pity. He knew exactly who I was and how my mind worked. As we climbed the stairs and stepped into the luxurious mahogany-paneled cabin, he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a brand new encrypted smartphone. "I already had my security team ping your original device," he said, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water from the jet's bar. "Your mother turned it off the moment she boarded her flight to Monaco. But I had my forensic accountants do a preliminary sweep on your brother-in-law while I was negotiating your release. Look at the screen." I took the phone. Displayed on the illuminated screen was a freshly intercepted, highly confidential internal email from Trent's investment firm in Atlanta. The numbers highlighted in red were staggering. Trent was not just a successful finance bro. He was running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme. He had been quietly embezzling millions from his high-net-worth clients over the past 2 years. The €500,000 in that duffel bag was not spending money for the vow renewal. It was his untraceable getaway fund. He had intended to stash it in an offshore account in Monaco and disappear, leaving his firm to collapse and my sister to face the fallout. And when customs got too close, he used me as a human shield. My eyes turned to ice as I read the final paragraph of the intercepted dossier. Trent's firm was currently under stealth investigation by the SEC, and he knew the walls were closing in. He had deliberately set me up to take the fall for the smuggled cash, knowing my family would back his lie to avoid a public scandal. I looked up at Isaiah. The luxury of the jet, the hum of the engines, the betrayal of my own blood, it all crystallized into a single razor-sharp directive. I was done being the silent financial safety net. I was done being the ugly, unmarried sister who carried the burden so Jasmine could shine. "Tell your pilot to change the flight plan," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady calm. "We are not going back to the States. We are going to Monaco." The engines of the private jet roared as we banked sharply over the European coastline, altering our trajectory toward the Mediterranean. I sank into the plush leather seat and opened the encrypted laptop Isaiah had placed in front of me. I immediately bypassed the standard security protocols and synced my new device to my personal cloud storage. The screen illuminated with a flood of incoming alerts. I opened my family's shared calendar and the linked communication server my father used for his congregation. Elias had not wasted a single minute. While I was sitting in a freezing detention cell, facing federal smuggling charges, my father was busy spinning a masterpiece of public relations. He had blasted a mass message to the entire megachurch board of elders, the regional directors of Jack and Jill, and every elite socialite in his Atlanta contact list. The message was displayed in bold, pious letters across my screen. "It is with a heavy heart that Valerie and I ask for your immediate prayers," the message read. "Our eldest daughter, Camille, suffered a severe mental breakdown this morning at the airport in Paris. The pressure of her isolated single lifestyle has finally taken its toll. She became erratic, aggressive, and had to be institutionalized by the local authorities. We are heartbroken, but we must remain strong for Jasmine as she renews her sacred vows this weekend. Please respect our privacy and pray for our troubled daughter so as not to ruin Jasmine's blessed weekend." I stared at the glowing words. Institutionalized. A mental breakdown. They had literally abandoned me to take the fall for Trent's federal crimes, and my father was using his pastoral authority to preemptively discredit anything I might say if I managed to get out. He was painting me as a hysterical, jealous spinster to protect his flawless family optics. Isaiah leaned against the mahogany bar, swirling a glass of sparkling water. He watched my face closely, his dark eyes taking in the sheer audacity of my father's lies. "Why do they treat you like this?" Isaiah asked, his voice calm but layered with a dangerous curiosity. You are the smartest person in any room you walk into. Why are you their designated casualty? I did not cry. I did not break down. The last tear I would ever shed for my family had dried up in that French detention room. I turned my attention back to the keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys. I linked the laptop directly to the jet's massive presentation monitors. Because 3 years ago, my father decided that optics were more important than reality. I said, my voice dead calm, as financial documents began populating the screens around us. Trent was failing. His finance firm was hemorrhaging money, and his lifestyle with Jasmine was entirely built on credit. Elias forced me to co-sign a massive commercial business loan for Trent. He told me that Black excellence meant keeping the wealth in the family, and that it was my duty to support my sister's marriage, because I had no family of my own. I brought up a specific wire transfer receipt from 3 years prior, highlighting the routing numbers. They thought I was just the obedient, invisible scapegoat, I continued. They thought I just signed the papers and walked away. But I knew Trent was a fraud. So when I co-signed that loan, I secretly embedded a tracking beacon on the funds. I have been monitoring every single dollar that moves through his firm's accounts for 36 months. Isaiah set his glass down, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. You tracked the money. I tracked every cent, I confirmed. Isaiah tapped a button on his console, opening a secure communication line. He did not offer me sympathy. He offered me ammunition. You have full access to my forensic accounting team in New York, he said. Tell them what you need. For the next 40 minutes, the jet transformed into a war room. I directed Isaiah's elite team of hackers and accountants to trace the exact serial numbers of the bearer bonds and the cash Trent had tried to abandon with me. We ripped through his firm's firewalls. Trent had been sloppy arrogant in his belief that nobody would ever look closely at his books. We traced the embezzled millions bouncing through shell companies until they finally landed in an offshore account in Cyprus. Trent had systematically drained his clients' retirement funds, preparing to collapse the company and walk away completely unscathed. Isaiah looked at the final routing destination on the screen. He is covering his tracks quickly, Isaiah noted. According to these internal emails, Trent's firm just wired a $200,000 retainer to an elite crisis management agency. They hired Aegis Consulting to clean up the missing funds and bury the SEC investigation. Aegis is the most ruthless crisis firm on the eastern seaboard. They will destroy any evidence tying Trent to this embezzlement. I looked at Isaiah, letting the glow of the monitors reflect in my eyes. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy matte black titanium business card. I slid it across the table toward him. Aegis Consulting is not going to save Trent, I said smoothly. Isaiah picked up the card. It bore the Aegis logo and beneath it a single name. Camille, founder and chief executive officer. Isaiah looked from the card to me, the realization hitting him. You are not just a public relations consultant. You are the shadow founder of Aegis. I own the firm, I confirmed. Trent just paid my company $200,000 to hide his crimes. He handed me the exact shovel I am going to use to bury him. I literally control all his financial secrets, his legal fate, and the very team he expects to save him. The air in the cabin cracked with adrenaline, but before Isaiah could respond, a blaring red emergency alert hijacked the screen of my encrypted phone. A secondary alarm echoed from the laptop. I grabbed the device, my heart slamming against my ribs. The alert was coming from my primary wealth management bank in Atlanta. Someone is trying to bypass my two-factor authentication, I said, my fingers flying over the screen to trace the intrusion. It is an emergency asset freeze protocol. Isaiah moved to stand behind my seat, his eyes tracking the code scrolling down the monitor. They are submitting legal documentation to the bank, he noted, his voice tightening. I pulled up the scanned document the bank had just received. It was a medical power of attorney. The document claimed that I was mentally incapacitated, citing my supposed institutionalization in Paris. The signature at the bottom belonged to my father, Elias. He had forged a medical directive to take immediate legal control of my life. Trent is using my father's smear campaign to freeze my personal bank accounts. I realize the sheer evil of their strategy settling over me. Trent knows I saw the cash in that bag. He knows I am a threat. So he is using my father's lies to legally declare me insane. If this power of attorney processes, they will seize my assets, lock me out of my own company, and leave me completely destitute. How long until the Monaco banks open and validate the transfer? Isaiah demanded, already reaching for his own secure line. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. I have exactly 47 minutes to intercept this freeze before I lose everything I have built over the last decade. My family is trying to wipe me off the map. Isaiah looked at me, the billionaire tech mogul stepping fully into the role of a wartime general. Tell your hackers at Aegis to block the routing authorization. We are touching down in Monaco in 20 minutes. It is time to crash a wedding. The quiet hum of the jet engines faded into the background as Isaiah tapped a button on his sleek center console, opening a secure encrypted communication line. He did not offer meaningless platitudes or pity. He offered ammunition. Within seconds, he had his elite forensic accounting team in New York on a secure video link. The massive presentation monitors lining the mahogany-paneled cabin flickered from digital flight maps to cascading lines of raw financial data. Camille took the wireless keyboard, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. She fed Isaiah's team the exact tracking beacon codes she had embedded 3 years ago. Trent thought he was a financial genius, but he was just an arrogant finance bro, leaving a trail of digital fingerprints everywhere he touched. For the next 20 minutes, the jet transformed into a high-altitude war room. Camille and the New York team sliced through the flimsy firewalls Trent had set up to hide his tracks. The money bounced through shell companies in Delaware, funneled through the Cayman Islands, and finally settled on a single monitor: Cyprus. Trent had systematically drained his high-net-worth clients' retirement funds. He was not just embezzling a few $1,000s to cover bad investments. He was planning to let his entire firm collapse, let Jasmine take the devastating public humiliation, and vanish into the Mediterranean with his offshore stash. Isaiah leaned forward, his dark eyes tracking a separate stream of data on a secondary monitor. He pointed at a newly flagged transaction. Trent is panicking, Isaiah noted, his voice tight with concentration. According to these internal emails, he knows the Securities and Exchange Commission is sniffing around his accounts. Look at this outgoing wire transfer from yesterday afternoon. He just wired a $200,000 retainer to Aegis Consulting. Isaiah looked at Camille, his expression grim. Aegis is the most ruthless crisis management agency on the Eastern Seaboard. They specialize in burying federal investigations and making damning evidence disappear overnight. If Trent has them on payroll unraveling, this gets significantly harder. They will scrub his servers clean before we even land. Camille did not panic. She did not even blink. She slowly reached into her designer tote bag, bypassed her makeup compact, and pulled out a heavy matte black titanium business card. She placed it on the polished table and slid it smoothly across to Isaiah. Isaiah picked up the cold metal card. His eyes scanned the silver-embossed lettering. Camille, founder and chief executive officer. Aegis Consulting is not going to save him, Camille said, her voice smooth and deadly. I built Aegis from the ground up out of a tiny Manhattan apartment, while my family thought I was just a basic public relations worker answering phones. Trent just paid my company $200,000 to clean up his mess. I literally control his financial secrets, his legal fate, and the very team he expects to cover his tracks. Isaiah stared at the business card, then looked up at Camille. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his face. He let out a dark laugh of pure, unfiltered respect. You are not just a step ahead of them. You own the board. But the triumphant moment was violently shattered by a piercing alarm. A blaring red alert hijacked the screen of the new encrypted smartphone Isaiah had given her. A secondary warning siren echoed from the laptop speakers, flashing a hostile intrusion warning across all the cabin monitors. Camille grabbed the device, her heart slamming violently against her ribs. My primary wealth management bank in Atlanta, she said, her voice dropping an octave as she typed furiously to trace the origin of the breach. Someone is executing a hostile override on my two-factor authentication. They are bypassing my security questions. Isaiah moved to stand directly behind her seat, his eyes locked on the scrolling code. They are submitting physical legal documentation to the bank managers, he observed, watching the file transfer protocols light up the screen. It is an emergency asset freeze. Camille pulled up the scanned document the bank had just received and displayed it on the main monitor. The breath left her lungs. It was a medical power of attorney. The legal document claimed that Camille was completely mentally incapacitated, citing the exact fake institutionalization in Paris that her father had just broadcasted to their entire mega-church congregation. Her eyes drifted to the bottom of the page. There, in bold black ink, was her father's unmistakable signature. Elias had legally declared his own daughter insane. He had sworn to a judge and a bank that she was a danger to herself, effectively stripping her of her human rights, just to hand Trent the keys to her financial empire. Trent knows I saw the cash in that bag at the airport, Camille realized aloud, the sheer breathtaking evil of their strategy settling over her like a suffocating blanket. He knows I am a threat to his freedom, so he is using my father's smear campaign to freeze my personal bank accounts. If this power of attorney processes, they will seize all my assets. They will lock me out of my own company. I will be left completely destitute and legally voiceless. She glanced at the digital clock mounted on the cabin bulkhead. The numbers were ticking down relentlessly. I have exactly 47 minutes to intercept this freeze before the Monaco banks open and validate the international transfer, she said, her hands gripping the edge of the table. My family is trying to wipe me off the map so they can enjoy a luxury vacation. Isaiah stepped back, straightening his posture, the billionaire tech mogul shifting effortlessly into the role of a wartime general. He buttoned his suit jacket, his eyes locked on hers with absolute, unwavering support. Tell your hackers at Aegis to block that routing authorization immediately, Isaiah commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. The Mediterranean breeze drifting through the open terrace doors of the Hotel de Paris ballroom did nothing to cut the stifling pretense inside the room. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over a sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. Jasmine stood at the exact center of the room, exactly where she had always demanded to be. She wore a $20,000 beaded couture gown that shimmered with every calculated breath she took. She was surrounded by the elite wives of the Jack and Jill regional board, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief. It has just been the most harrowing 24 hours. Jasmine sighed, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. We had to leave Camille in a facility in Paris. The doctors said her mental break was severe. She was screaming, totally detached from reality. I wanted to cancel tonight, I really did. But Trent and my father insisted we had to stay strong and celebrate love in the face of this tragedy. The circle of wealthy socialites murmured their sympathies, placing manicured hands on Jasmine's shoulders. They praised her resilience, whispering about how tragic it was that the older sister could not hold her life together while the younger sister carried the family grace. A few yards away, near an ice sculpture carved into the shape of swans, Trent was working a different angle. He was aggressively swirling a glass of scotch, cornering 3 of Elias's wealthiest church donors. Trent flashed his perfectly capped teeth, slapping one of the older men on the back. The market is volatile, sure. Trent pitched, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial hum. But my firm just secured a massive offshore influx. We are completely insulated. In fact, we are positioned to acquire assets that Vanguard Capital is currently sleeping on. You gentlemen want to wire your portfolios over by Monday if you want in on the ground floor of this expansion. Elias stood near the bar watching his son-in-law reel in fresh capital, his chest puffed out with pride. Valerie was busy instructing the waitstaff to ensure the vintage champagne flowed freely. They had successfully contained the Paris disaster. The narrative was set. Camille was the crazy, isolated spinster locked away in a French ward, and the golden couple was shining brighter than ever. Then the massive mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open. They did not just open, They slammed back against the gilded walls with a resounding crack that echoed over the chatter. The string quartet playing in the corner missed a note, squeaked, and abruptly stopped playing. The sudden silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. Every head turned toward the entrance. I did not sneak in through the back. I did not hide behind the catering staff or slip in looking for a quiet conversation. I walked straight through the center archway, wearing a custom emerald green runway gown that fit me like liquid armor. My hair was flawlessly styled, my posture radiating the kind of absolute lethal control that only comes from knowing you hold the match to a powder keg. I was not alone. Isaiah walked half a step beside me, his charcoal suit absorbing the light, his presence commanding immediate breathless attention from every business mogul in the room who recognized the reclusive tech billionaire. Behind us, marching in perfect synchronization, was a solid wall of 6 elite Monaco resort security guards. The champagne flute slipped from Jasmine's fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces, the sound cutting through the dead silence of the room. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The tragic, distressed bride routine instantly vanished, replaced by sheer, unfiltered terror. Trent froze mid-sentence, his scotch glass suspended halfway to his mouth. The investors he had been charming turned away from him, their eyes locked on Isaiah in stunned recognition. Elias dropped his pastoral smile. Valerie practically lunged forward, her eyes darting frantically toward the church elders who were now staring at me in utter confusion. This was the woman they had been told was locked in a padded room just an hour ago. I did not stop walking until I reached the exact center of the ballroom, invading Jasmine's carefully constructed spotlight. I looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every socialite, every church elder, every investor who had just been fed a diet of my family's lies. I turned my eyes to my mother. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the marble room. It is loud, clear, and perfectly sane. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but it seems my invitation was lost in the mail. Or perhaps it was left at gate 24. Valerie broke from her paralysis. She marched forward, her face flushed dark with panic and fury. She tried to step between me and the Jack and Jill board members, waving her hands frantically at the security guards standing behind me. "Security!" Valerie shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "What are you doing? Get her out of here! She is having an episode. She escaped her facility. Grab her!" The security guards did not move an inch. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, their eyes fixed straight ahead, completely ignoring my mother's frantic orders. I looked at Valerie stepping closer, so she had to crane her neck to meet my eyes. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute ice in my tone made her physically flinch. "Nobody is grabbing me, Mom," I said, "and nobody is having an episode. Unless you count the one where your golden son-in-law packed $500,000 in stolen undeclared bearer bonds into a duffel bag, shoved it into my hands at airport security, and let me face international federal charges while you reached into my purse and stole my passport." The collective gasp from the room sucked the remaining air out of the ballroom. The socialites backed away from Jasmine. The investors stepped away from Trent. "You are a liar!" Jasmine screamed. Stepping forward, her face contorted with the ugly, vicious jealousy she usually saved for behind closed doors. "She is lying. She is just jealous. She has always been jealous of my marriage. I did not even look at my sister." I raised my hand and snapped my fingers once. The general manager of the Hotel de Paris stepped out from behind the wall of security guards. He did not look at Elias or Trent. He walked directly up to Valerie holding a silver tray. Resting on the tray was a thick, itemized invoice. I smiled at my mother, a cold, terrifying curve of the lips. "I am not jealous, Jasmine. I am the bank. Mom, you booked this entire $150,000 weekend under my corporate account authorization. I just canceled the authorization. The front desk requires immediate payment in full, or the police waiting in the lobby will clear this ballroom in 5 minutes. Pay up." The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the diamond Rolex on Isaiah's wrist. Valerie stared at the silver tray, her perfectly manicured hands beginning to tremble. She did not reach for the heavy leather-bound invoice. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate denial, waiting for someone to break the tension and rescue her from the reality of the moment. "Camille, this is not the time or the place for one of your tantrums," my father Elias finally said. He stepped forward, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, his voice dropping into the deep, soothing, hypnotic resonance he used for his Sunday sermons. "You are clearly exhausted. The trauma of the airport has confused you. We forgive you for this outburst. Let us step into a private suite out of the public eye and pray on this together as a family." I did not break eye contact with him. "Do not use your pulpit voice on me, Dad," I said, my tone lethal and completely devoid of emotion. "It might work on the thousands of devoted parishioners funding your private jet leases, but it does not work on the daughter whose signature you just forged." Elias's pastoral smile froze. The wealthy church donors standing near the ice sculpture exchanged alarmed, murmured glances. 32 minutes ago, I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the shattered champagne flute on the marble floor. "You submitted a medical power of attorney to my primary wealth management bank in Atlanta. You swore under penalty of perjury that I was institutionalized in a psychiatric ward in Paris. You attempted to legally declare me incompetent so you could seize my personal assets and take control of my company, all while I was sitting in a freezing detention cell being interrogated by French federal agents for a crime your son-in-law committed." Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Elias's face drained of color, his righteous facade instantly melting into the panicked expression of a man caught in a federal lie. "She is delusional," Trent suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He pushed his way past the investors, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is making this all up because she is bitter. Security, do your jobs. She is trespassing. Remove her immediately." Isaiah stepped out from my right side, his presence alone silencing Trent's outburst. The billionaire tech mogul did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "The only person trespassing on borrowed time is you, Trent," Isaiah said smoothly. "I am Isaiah Sterling, and unlike your fraudulent investment firm, my forensic accounting team does not leave a digital paper trail." The three high-net-worth investors Trent had been schmoozing just moments ago visibly recoiled. One of them, a prominent real estate developer from Atlanta, narrowed his eyes. "What is he talking about?" "Trent," the developer demanded, his voice thick with suspicion. "What paper trail?" Isaiah answered for him. "The paper trail that connects the $3 million Trent just siphoned from your retirement portfolios to an untraceable shell corporation in Cyprus," Isaiah stated, his eyes locked on Trent. "Trent has been running a massive Ponzi scheme for 2 years. The $500,000 in undeclared bearer bonds he shoved into Camille's hands at Charles de Gaulle was his getaway fund. The Securities and Exchange Commission is freezing his domestic accounts as we speak." Trent opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting frantically toward the ballroom exits. The general manager of the hotel stepped forward again, clearing his throat and extending the silver tray directly toward my mother. "Madame," the manager said, his French accent clipped and unyielding. "The balance of 150,000 euros remains outstanding. The corporate card on file has been actively revoked by the account holder. If a new payment method is not provided within the next 60 seconds, I will be forced to involve the local authorities waiting in the lobby." Valerie snapped out of her paralysis, grabbing Trent's arm with bruising force. "Trent, give him your card," she hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer desperation. "Give him the black card. Just pay the bill so we can get her out of here and deal with this privately." Trent fumbled frantically inside his tuxedo jacket. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped his leather wallet onto the floor before retrieving a sleek, heavy metal credit card. He practically shoved it onto the manager's silver tray. The manager pulled a mobile payment terminal from his jacket pocket. He inserted the heavy metal card. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting a harsh, flat rejection tone. The manager looked at the screen, his expression entirely devoid of pity. "Declined," the manager stated flatly. "Try it again." Jasmine screamed, finally breaking her silence. She lunged forward, her $20,000 gown rustling aggressively as she snatched the card from the manager. It is a priority black card. It has no limit. Swipe it again. It is not going to work, Jasmine, I said, looking at my sister with absolute terrifying pity. The SEC froze his domestic assets an hour ago, and the offshore Cyprus account he was planning to flee to, the one he hired my crisis management firm to hide, I had my hackers block the routing authorization mid-flight. He is completely, undeniably penniless. Jasmine turned slowly to look at her husband. The golden couple, the pristine image of generational wealth and perfection, shattered in real time. "You promised me the transfer went through." Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You said my father's church loan was just a temporary bridge until the Monaco accounts cleared." Trent, realizing his facade was entirely destroyed, finally snapped. He shoved Jasmine's hands away from him, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Your father is tapped out," Jasmine, Trent yelled, exposing the final devastating lie of the evening to the entire room. "He mortgaged the church's community center just to pay for your ridiculous dress, because he is obsessed with keeping up appearances. There is no generational wealth. You are all completely broke." Elias stumbled backward as if he had been physically struck. The church elders surrounding him immediately began stepping away, their faces registering the profound betrayal of their pastor, stealing from their community to fund his daughter's vanity. Valerie covered her face, letting out a loud, humiliating sob as the wealthy socialites she had spent years trying to impress openly stared at her in absolute disgust. I looked at the four of them, watching the empire of lies they had built upon my back burn to the ground in a matter of minutes. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt entirely, wonderfully free. I turned toward the heavy mahogany doors just as four uniformed Monegasque police officers strode into the ballroom, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. I smiled, stepping aside to give them a clear, unobstructed view of my brother-in-law. "Officers!" I said, my voice ringing out through the dead silence of the ballroom. "The man you want for the international federal smuggling incident at Charles de Gaulle is right there." The silence in the ballroom fractured the moment the four Monegasque police officers stepped fully into the light of the crystal chandeliers. Trent's face went from pale shock to a deep mottled red. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. The polished, untouchable finance director vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered man watching his house of cards collapse in real time. He lunged forward, his hands curled into fists, but the solid wall of hotel security flanking Isaiah and me instantly closed ranks. They formed an impenetrable physical barrier, forcing Trent to halt just inches away from my face. "She is a pathological liar," Trent screamed, spit flying from his lips, as he pointed a shaking finger directly at me. He turned his frantic gaze toward the police officers, his voice dripping with the arrogant, unearned authority he had wielded over my family for years. "Officers, arrest this woman immediately. She is trespassing. She is harassing my family. She stole a corporate credit card and crashed a private elite function. She is completely unhinged." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, letting his rage wash over me like a warm breeze. Trent puffed out his chest, leaning hard into the privilege he assumed made him invincible in a European luxury resort. He was a wealthy white American businessman in a bespoke tuxedo. I was the black woman he had designated as his convenient casualty. In his mind, the hierarchy was absolute. He turned back to the crowd, raising his hands in a gesture of exasperated victimhood, looking at the wealthy investors and socialites for backup. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Trent announced, his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "She is a ghetto dropout. She could not handle the pressure of real success, so she spends her life trying to tear down those of us who actually built something." The insult was not new. He had used that exact phrase 5 years ago, sitting at my parents' dining room table when he convinced my father to cut off my college tuition. Trent had argued that my double major in communications and finance was a waste of the family's money, insisting I lacked the pedigree to ever succeed in the corporate world. My parents had agreed, forcing me to build Aegis from the ground up, entirely self-funded, while they bankrolled Trent's fraudulent firm with loans I was forced to co-sign. My father, Elias, rushed to Trent's side, desperate to salvage the situation and protect the man who held the keys to his own financial ruin. Elias adopted his most sorrowful pastoral expression, approaching the lead police officer with his hands raised in a gesture of pious supplication. "Officers, I sincerely apologize for this disruption," Elias said smoothly, his deep baritone rolling through the room, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing 3 feet away. "This is a private family matter. My daughter is deeply unwell. We have been trying to get her the psychiatric help she needs, but she has grown violent and delusional. Please just remove her quietly so we can proceed with my other daughter's vows." Jasmine chimed in right on cue, clutching Trent's arm and sobbing perfectly photogenic tears. "She ruined my wedding," Jasmine wailed, leaning her head against Trent's shoulder. "She is stalking us. Please take her away." Trent smiled. It was a small, ugly, triumphant smirk. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks, utterly convinced that his performance had worked. He stepped aside, making a sweeping theatrical gesture toward me, inviting the police to do exactly what he had ordered. "Take her out in handcuffs," Trent demanded, looking the lead officer dead in the eye. "And I want to press full charges for harassment and corporate fraud." The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe expression, did not look at Trent. He did not look at my father. He looked directly at Isaiah. Isaiah simply gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The officer stepped forward. His heavy boots echoed sharply against the marble floor. Trent stood tall, adjusting his posture, waiting for the officer to walk past him and grab me. Instead, the officer stopped abruptly. He grabbed Trent by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, spun him around with brutal practiced efficiency, and slammed him chest first against the nearest marble pillar. Trent let out a strangled gasp as the breath was knocked out of his lungs. "What are you doing?" Trent shrieked, his voice cracking in sheer panic as he tried to wriggle out of the officer's iron grip. "Get your hands off me. I am an American citizen. You are arresting the wrong person." The sharp metallic clack of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around Trent's wrists echoed through the ballroom, drowning out his protests. The second officer pulled a thick official dossier from his jacket. It was the exact dossier Isaiah's forensic team had forwarded to Interpol 20 minutes prior, detailing the bearer bonds, the offshore Cyprus accounts, and the immediate flight risk Trent posed. Trenton Hayes, the lead officer, stated in heavily accented English, his grip on Trent's collar unyielding. "You are under arrest for international financial fraud, embezzlement, and the smuggling of undeclared bearer bonds across European borders. You have no diplomatic immunity here." No, Jasmine screamed, lunging forward, but one of the hotel security guards effortlessly blocked her path. She fell to her knees, her $20,000 gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute, her perfectly manicured hands covering her face. Valerie let out a piercing shriek, clutching Elias's arm as she watched her golden son-in-law being hauled away. Elias stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. The entire congregation of elite socialites and wealthy investors watched their pristine family legacy disintegrate into a criminal spectacle. "Call the embassy!" Trent screamed, thrashing wildly, as 2 officers dragged him backward toward the service elevators. His polished loafers slipped frantically against the marble. "Elias, call my lawyers. Camille set me up. She is a liar." I watched his face turn purple as he was dragged out of the grand ballroom, his screams fading down the corridor until the heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The high-net-worth investors were already pulling out their phones, frantically dialing their own crisis teams to freeze their assets and distance themselves from Trent's firm. The Jack and Jill socialites were backing away from my mother as if she carried a plague. Isaiah stepped closer to me, his dark eyes scanning the panicked crowd. "A flawless execution," he murmured, his voice pitched so only I could hear. "He is done." I looked down at the shattered champagne glass at my feet. The initial rush of adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Trent was in handcuffs, my parents were publicly disgraced, and Jasmine's manufactured fairy tale was over. But as I looked at the panicked investors scrambling toward the exits, my blood turned to ice water. Trent was a coward, but he was a coward who managed money for some of the most ruthless offshore syndicates in the world. He had built his Ponzi scheme using capital from people who did not rely on lawyers to settle their debts. He had powerful, dangerous men on speed dial men who would be looking for their missing millions the exact second the news of his arrest broke. Trent was going to a European federal prison, but the war for my company, my assets, and my life was far from over. Isaiah stepped closer to me as the heavy mahogany doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of Trent's frantic screaming. The grand ballroom of the Hotel de Paris felt like the aftermath of a localized earthquake. The string quartet had long fled, and the remaining high-net-worth investors were frantically dialing their crisis management teams, desperate to scrub their portfolios clean of Trent's toxic footprint. Isaiah looked down at his phone, the screen illuminating his sharp jawline. His dark eyes narrowed. "He is already making calls," Isaiah murmured, his voice pitched so low only I could hear. "Trent has his syndicate investors on the line. They are wiring a massive, untraceable bail bond directly to the Monaco magistrates. He will not be in that holding cell for more than a few hours." I nodded, my jaw tightening. I knew it. Trent was a coward, but a cornered coward with access to dark offshore millions was the most dangerous kind of enemy. If he secured bail before the international warrants fully processed, he would use every violent resource at his disposal to hunt me down and silence me. The war was far from over. Across the room, my sister was refusing to wait for the dust to settle. Jasmine was a creature of optics, and seeing the narrative slip from her manicured grasp activated her absolute worst survival instincts. Spotting my father's most prominent church elders and the elite Jack and Jill socialites whispering in horrified clusters, she shifted into overdrive. "This way, please, everyone, step away from her," Jasmine wailed, her voice cracking with a masterclass display of manufactured trauma. She frantically waved her arms, herding the bewildered wealthy elites toward the private velvet-draped VIP lounge attached to the rear of the ballroom. She grabbed the arm of Elder Thomas, burying her face in his lapel. "The devil is testing our family tonight. We need to pray. We need to protect ourselves from this spiritual warfare. Please come inside." Valerie and Elias hurried after her, desperate to escape the judging stares of the Monaco elite. They scurried into the VIP lounge, pulling their most valuable social assets inside with them. "Stay here," I told Isaiah, my voice hard. "Secure this perimeter. Do not let anyone else leave." I turned and walked slowly toward the VIP lounge. The heavy oak doors had been pulled shut, but not locked. I pushed them open, stepping into a room that smelled heavily of aged bourbon and expensive cigars. The juxtaposition of holy men seeking refuge in a room designed for vice was not lost on me. Jasmine had thrown herself across a tufted velvet chaise lounge, sobbing violently into her hands, while the church elders stood around her in a protective, awkward circle, murmuring frantic prayers for deliverance. Valerie was furiously scrolling through her phone, her hands shaking, while Elias paced the Persian rug, muttering under his breath about legal injunctions and defamation suits. The moment the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the prayers abruptly stopped. Jasmine ripped her hands away from her face. The tears vanished instantly. Her eyes were red, but they blazed with pure, unfiltered venom. She leaped up from the chaise lounge, her $20,000 couture gown swishing violently around her ankles. She pointed a shaking, accusing finger right at my chest. "You could not stand it, could you?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the mahogany-paneled walls. The pious weeping victim routine was gone, replaced by a vicious, deeply ugly fury. "You had to destroy my life because your own is so pathetic." I did not say a single word. I simply stood there, my emerald runway gown catching the dim amber light, projecting an absolute unshakable calm. My silence only infuriated her more. She was spiraling, grasping blindly at childhood rivalries to justify the absolute collapse of her adult life. "You have always been obsessed with ruining me," Jasmine screamed, taking an aggressive step closer, her chest heaving. "You are sick with jealousy. You have always been jealous of my light skin. You have always been jealous of my perfect marriage. You hate that I am the beautiful one, the one Mom and Dad actually love and respect." The church elders shifted uncomfortably, clearly shocked by the raw, toxic vanity pouring from their pastor's pristine daughter. But Jasmine was too far gone to care about her audience. She was entirely unhinged, fully reverting to the cruel, spoiled teenager Valerie had meticulously engineered her to be. "You have always tried to embarrass me," she continued, her voice growing shriller by the second. "Just like my debutante ball. Do you remember that, Camille? You could not handle the fact that I was the center of attention, the absolute queen of the season. So you showed up to my gala looking like absolute trash. You wore a cheap off-the-rack synthetic dress to a high society ball just to humiliate me in front of the entire regional board. You have always been nothing but a jealous ghetto dropout trying to drag me down to your level." Valerie squeezed her eyes shut physically, turning her head away from the scene. Elias suddenly stopped pacing, his spine snapping rigidly straight. They both knew exactly why I had worn that dress, and the sheer humiliating panic returning to their eyes was delicious. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I closed the distance between us in 3 long, deliberate strides. Jasmine instinctively took a step back, but I invaded her personal space, stopping mere inches from her face. I looked down at her, my expression forged from absolute ice. "I wore a cheap, off-the-rack dress to your debutante ball." "Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, razor-sharp whisper that carried perfectly through the dead silence of the lounge. "Because the morning of your perfect, flawless gala, the luxury catering company threatened to pack up their trucks and walk out." "Do you know why?" "Because Dad's $50,000 deposit check bounced." Jasmine blinked, her mouth falling open slightly. The church elders behind her gasped collectively, staring at my father in absolute shock. I kept my eyes locked onto hers, refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her escape the reality she had ignored for a decade. Mom was having a full panic attack on the kitchen floor. Dad was literally begging the catering manager on his hands and knees to stay so his reputation would not be ruined. So I drove to the bank. I withdrew every single cent of my college savings account, $52,000, and I handed it to the catering manager in cash so your wealthy friends would have their champagne and their caviar. Jasmine's face drained of all color. Her eyes darted frantically toward our parents, seeking a desperate denial. Elias was staring intently at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Valerie had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, humiliating sobs. "I did not wear that cheap dress to embarrass you," I said, my voice dripping with absolute lethal contempt. "I wore it because I had exactly $40 left to my name. I sacrificed my education, my degree, and my future to save this family's fraudulent, pathetic reputation." I leaned in closer until she could physically feel the chill of my breath against her cheek. "I am not jealous of your perfection, Jasmine. I bought your perfection. I paid for it. And tonight the lease is up." The silence following my declaration hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Jasmine's mouth opened and closed silently, her eyes darting frantically toward our parents. For the first time in her pampered life, she had absolutely no script, no defense, and no one to hide behind. The illusion of her flawless existence had been ripped away, exposing the desperate, bankrupt reality underneath. Before Jasmine could formulate a response, Elias stepped forward. He pushed his way past the bewildered church elders, placing himself directly between Jasmine and me. He squared his shoulders, puffing out his chest to his full height. When he spoke, he completely bypassed his soothing, diplomatic tone. He weaponized the booming, authoritative voice he used to command thousands of people from his pulpit every Sunday morning. "You have gone too far, Camille." Elias thundered, the sheer volume of his voice vibrating against the crystal decanters on the lounge bar. "You come into this room poisoning the air with your bitterness, trying to destroy your sister on the most important weekend of her life. You are a disgrace to our family, a disgrace to our community, and a disgrace to our church." The socialites in this room flinched at the raw hostility in his voice. Valerie stood up straight, crossing her arms visually, aligning herself with her husband's self-righteous fury. Elias pointed a rigid finger toward the ballroom doors. "You will turn around right now," Elias commanded, his face flushing with dark anger. "You will march out to those officers, apologize to your sister, and officially retract your statements about Trent. You will fix this mess. Do it now or you are dead to us, Camille. I will completely disown you." I looked at the man who had spent his entire life valuing his public image over my well-being. I looked at the mother who had stood by and watched him do it. The threat of being disowned by them should have been terrifying. Instead, it was the punchline to a joke they did not even realize they were telling. I smiled. It was a slow, cold, razor-sharp smile that made Elias's extended hand falter. "You cannot disown this bank, Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm against his shouting. "And as for fixing your messes, I am officially retiring from that position. But since you brought up my statements about Trent, let us verify them." I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I tapped a single button. On the far wall of the VIP lounge, a massive 80-inch presentation screen had been quietly looping a slideshow of Jasmine and Trent's engagement photos. The screen instantly went black. A split second later, it flickered back to life, broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-definition security feed. The timestamp in the bottom corner proved the footage was taken less than 48 hours ago. The location tag across the top read Charles de Gaulle Airport Terminal 2E Security Checkpoint 4. The wealthy socialites and church elders instinctively stepped closer to the screen, their eyes widening in confusion. I had Isaiah's security team pull this directly from the French federal authorities, I announced to the room, never taking my eyes off my parents. "Watch closely. It is a masterpiece." On the massive screen, the silent footage played out in brutal clarity. It showed our family standing near the luggage conveyor belt. It showed me turning my back to speak to a ticketing agent. And it showed Trent. A collective gasp rippled through the VIP lounge as the high-definition camera captured Trent, wiping sweat from his forehead, looking panicked. The footage clearly showed him unzipping a heavy black leather duffel bag, pulling out a thick, unmarked folio, and frantically shoving it deep into the front pocket of my carry-on suitcase. He zipped my bag shut and immediately backed away, putting his hands in his pockets just as I turned back around. "Oh my word," one of the socialites whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. He planted it on her. He actually planted it on her. Elias stared at the screen, all the blood draining from his face. Valerie let out a strangled, panicked sound, taking a step backward, as if trying to merge into the velvet wallpaper. "Keep watching," I instructed the room, my voice dripping with ice. "The best part is yet to come." On the screen, two heavily armed French federal agents suddenly marched into the frame, pointing directly at our group. The footage showed me freezing in confusion, raising my hands as the officers approached my luggage. But the camera angle was perfectly positioned to capture what was happening right behind my back. While I was completely distracted by the armed guards, the footage showed Valerie stepping directly behind me. The socialites in the lounge let out sharp, horrified cries as the video clearly showed my mother reaching into my open designer purse. With terrifying, practiced efficiency, Valerie's fingers closed around my navy blue American passport. She slipped it out of my bag, shoved it deep into the pocket of her own cashmere trench coat, and took 2 large steps away from me, just as the officers grabbed my arms. The video ended freezing on the final frame of Valerie clutching her coat pocket while I was being dragged away in the background. The silence in the VIP lounge was absolute, broken only by the sound of Jasmine taking quick, hyperventilating breaths. The elite circle of family friends, the women Valerie had spent decades trying to impress, looked at my mother with expressions of pure, visceral disgust. Elder Thomas, the man who had been offering Jasmine spiritual comfort just moments ago, physically stepped away from Elias. He looked at my father, as if he were looking at the devil himself. "You stole her passport," Elder Thomas said, his voice shaking with absolute horror. "Your own flesh and blood. You left your daughter to face an international prison sentence with no identification just to protect a thief." Valerie's hands flew to her face. She shook her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes. "It was a mistake," Valerie babbled, her voice shrill and desperate. "I was panicked. The guards had guns. I was just trying to secure our travel documents. I did not mean to leave her. You reached into her purse while she was being detained. A prominent socialite snapped, her tone lethal. We all just watched you do it, Valerie. You threw your own child to the wolves. I locked eyes with Elias. His shoulders had completely slumped, his authoritative posture vanishing into thin air. He looked small, old, and utterly defeated. So tell me, Dad, I said, breaking the silence with a voice so sharp it practically cut the air in the room. Are you still planning to disown me? Because from where I am standing, you do not have any family left to protect you, do not have a reputation left to defend, and as of tomorrow morning, you will not have a church left to preach in. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for an apology I knew would never come. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and walked back out into the ballroom, leaving them locked in a cage of their own making. I did not even reach the heavy brass handle before a hand slammed against the oak door flat beside my head. The impact rattled the wood in its frame. I turned slowly. Elias was standing inches from me, his chest heaving, a sheen of frantic sweat coating his forehead. The polished, untouchable pastor was gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered man who was watching his access to private jets, country clubs, and unearned respect evaporate into thin air. He spun around to face the horrified church elders and the shrinking circle of elite socialites. He raised his hands, forcing a booming artificial laugh that sounded more like a bark. It is a fabrication, Elias declared, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. He pointed a rigid finger at the frozen image of Valerie stealing my passport on the massive presentation screen. It is a digital manipulation, a deep fake. Do you all forget what my daughter does for a living? She runs a crisis management and public relations firm. She manipulates media, buries scandals, and alters digital footprints for wealthy clients. She created this video to frame Trent and destroy her mother because she has always resented this family. Jasmine let out a sharp, breathless gasp, instantly latching onto the delusion. She wiped her ruined makeup, standing up straighter. Exactly, Jasmine sneered, her voice regaining its haughty, vicious edge. She faked it. She is just trying to extort us because Trent cut off her credit lines. Valerie lowered her hands from her face, her eyes darting toward Elias, clinging to the lifeline he had just thrown her. The church elders looked between the screen and their pastor, their expressions caught in a purgatory of doubt and denial. Elias saw their hesitation and doubled down, stepping away from the door and advancing on me. He puffed out his chest, his face flushing a dark, dangerous red. He was shifting tactics, moving from the victimized father to the ruthless patriarch, attempting to shame me into submission. You have made a fatal miscalculation tonight, Camille, Elias snarled, his voice dropping into a menacing, authoritative register. You think you can waltz into Monaco with a doctored video and a cheap security detail and take down a man like Trent? You think you can destroy my legacy with a parlor trick? Trent is not some street-level criminal you can bully. You clearly have no idea who you are dealing with or who is backing him. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly relaxed, letting him dig his grave as deep as he possibly could in front of the very people he had spent a lifetime swindling. Enlighten me, Dad, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Who is backing your fraudulent son-in-law? Elias sneered, a look of supreme, arrogant triumph flashing across his sweating face. Vanguard Capital, he announced, practically spitting the words at me as if they were a weapon. The premier private equity firm on the eastern seaboard. They manage tens of billions in global assets. They are the primary financial backers of Trent's offshore expansion. They vetted him. They cleared him. Do you honestly think a multi-billion-dollar syndicate would partner with a fraud? He turned back to the room, raising his hands, preaching to his terrified choir. Trent's firm is a subsidiary of the Vanguard portfolio, Elias boasted, his voice booming with renewed, frantic confidence. The men who run Vanguard do not play games, and they certainly do not let bitter, jealous family members disrupt their international holdings. The second Trent's lawyers post his bail, he is making one phone call. Elias stepped back into my personal space, his eyes wide and unhinged. When Trent gets out, Vanguard Capital will descend on you with a fleet of federal attorneys, Elias threatened, his voice echoing through the silent VIP lounge. They will crush your little boutique crisis firm into dust. They will bury you in federal court for corporate sabotage, defamation, and wire fraud. They will seize every asset you have ever built, and they will not stop until you are locked in a federal penitentiary. You are a disgrace to our community and our church. Apologize to your sister and retract your statements about Trent, or you are dead to us. I looked at my father. I looked at the absolute greed and worship of corporate power shining in his eyes. He had traded his faith, his daughter, and his integrity for a seat at a table that did not even exist. You are praying to the wrong God. Dad, I said softly. Before Elias could open his mouth to scream again, a sharp ringing sound cut through the heavy air of the lounge. It was the distinct piercing clink of crystal hitting marble. Every head in the VIP lounge snapped toward the back of the room. The heavy oak doors at the entrance had been pushed open. Isaiah Sterling had been standing in the shadows near the mahogany bar, silently watching the entire pathetic display unfold. He set his empty highball glass down on the polished marble counter. He stepped out of the shadows, moving with the slow, lethal grace of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. His tailored charcoal suit absorbed the ambient light, and his dark eyes were locked dead onto my father. The sheer, suffocating weight of his presence instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. The socialites gasped, shrinking back against the velvet walls. Elder Thomas visibly recoiled. Elias froze, his arrogant sneer faltering as he took in the billionaire tech mogul stalking toward him. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, his authoritative voice suddenly cracking with a faint underlying tremor of fear. "This is a private family suite. Security should have stopped you." Isaiah did not stop walking until he was standing directly beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. He looked down at Elias, completely unfazed by the pastor's booming demands. Isaiah's gaze was flat, cold, and entirely merciless. "That is a fascinating theory," Isaiah said, his voice, a smooth, dark baritone that commanded absolute terrified silence from everyone in the room. A slow, lethal smile spread across his face, a smile that promised absolute ruin. The silence that followed Isaiah's declaration was absolute and crushing. The name Vanguard Capital hung in the stale air of the VIP lounge like a suspended guillotine. Elias staggered backward, his jaw working furiously without producing a single sound. The booming righteous patriarch vanished instantly, replaced by a hollow, trembling shell of a man. He had just threatened to destroy me using the very financial empire owned by the man standing protectively at my side. Panic erupted like a match struck in a powder room. The polished veneer of the Monaco elite shattered. The wealthy socialites women who had spent the last 2 decades sipping champagne on Valerie's patio and praising her impeccable family physically recoiled. They pulled their designer wraps tight against their chests, backing away from my mother as if her sudden loss of status was a highly contagious disease. Valerie reached out desperately, her manicured fingers grazing the arm of a prominent banking heiress. The woman swatted my mother's hand away with a look of unfiltered revulsion, turning her back entirely. Elder Thomas gripped his silver-tipped cane, his face a mask of righteous disgust. He looked at Elias, shaking his head slowly. "You allowed your wife to leave your own daughter to face an international prison sentence?" Thomas said, his voice ringing with absolute condemnation. "You protected a thief to preserve your country club memberships. Do not bother returning to the pulpit on Sunday, Elias. The board will have your resignation by morning." Jasmine collapsed back onto the velvet chaise lounge, her hands tangling in her hair. She stared at Isaiah, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. The boundless wealth and corporate protection she thought her husband possessed was a mirage. It belonged to the man holding my hand. Before Elias could formulate a single pathetic excuse, a violent crash echoed through the room. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP lounge flew open, hitting the brass stops with a deafening bang. Trent stormed into the room. He looked like a man who had narrowly escaped a hurricane. His custom Italian suit was deeply wrinkled. His silk tie hung loose around his neck, and a sheen of frantic, greasy sweat coated his pale face. Despite the physical disarray, his arrogant, entitled swagger was cranked into overdrive. The massive untraceable bail bond wired by his syndicate investors had done exactly what he expected it to do. It had bought him out of a holding cell and artificially inflated his toxic ego right back to its maximum capacity. Trent completely ignored the horrified, judgmental stares of the church elders and the shrinking socialites. He did not notice his wife weeping on the velvet chaise, and he certainly did not register the sheer terror radiating from my parents. His bloodshot eyes scanned the room and locked immediately onto me. He marched forward, his dress shoes striking the hardwood floor with aggressive, heavy thuds. He stopped a few feet away, jabbing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Did you really think a temporary holding cell was going to be the end of me?" "Camille." Trent spat, his voice loud and erratic. "Did you honestly believe a couple of French border guards and a cheap security stunt could take down a man with my resources?" I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel. Isaiah remained casually at my side, his hands resting in his pockets, his dark eyes tracking Trent with the detached clinical interest of a scientist observing a doomed insect. Trent glanced at Isaiah for a fraction of a second, completely failing to recognize the billionaire tech mogul whose portfolio companies paid his salary. To Trent, Isaiah was just another obstacle, a nameless face standing in the way of his triumphant revenge. Trent turned his manic focus back to me. "You are going to pay for what you did at Charles de Gaulle," Trent threatened, his chest heaving as he puffed himself up. "I have my syndicate investors on speed dial." The Monaco magistrates took one look at the wire transfer and practically opened the cell doors for me. "Money talks, Camille. It always has. And my money is about to ruin your pathetic life." Valerie let out a desperate whimpering sound, trying to warn him, but Trent was entirely deaf to the room's atmosphere. He was riding the high of his own manufactured invincibility, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing in a room full of people who had just watched him commit a felony on a high-definition screen. "I am filing a massive defamation lawsuit against you the second the courts open tomorrow," Trent bragged, taking another aggressive step forward. "I am going to sue you for corporate sabotage, emotional distress, and criminal conspiracy. I am going to drag your name through every tabloid and legal journal on this continent until you are bankrupt and begging for mercy on the street." I tilted my head, studying his frantic, sweaty face. "You are going to sue me?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "With what leverage, Trent?" "The security footage of you planting stolen documents in my luggage is already in the hands of the federal authorities." Trent threw his head back and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that bordered on hysterical. "You think a single video clip matters to me?" he sneered, wiping a bead of sweat from his chin. "You think I rely on public defenders and cheap legal threats? I do not just fight lawsuits, Camille. I destroy the people who file them. I control the narrative." He crossed his arms, leaning back with a look of supreme, untouchable arrogance. "While you were busy playing dress-up and parading around this hotel, I was making calls from the magistrate's office," Trent boasted, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I did not just hire lawyers, I hired the absolute best reputation killers money can buy. I paid a massive 7-figure retainer to Aegis." A dead silence fell over the room. "You hired Aegis," I repeated, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "That is right," Trent gloated, mistaking my calm for fear. "The most ruthless elite crisis management firm on the globe. They specialize in annihilating reputations and burying scandals for high-net-worth clients. They are going to scrub my name spotless, and they are going to make you the villain of this entire story. They are going to dig up every mistake you have ever made, twist every fact, and feed you to the press. By the time Aegis is done with you, you will not be able to get a job pouring coffee." He smiled, a vicious, triumphant smirk that revealed his teeth. "I own the narrative now, Camille. Aegis works for me. You are officially finished." Trent froze. The smug, arrogant smirk melted off his face like wax exposed to a blowtorch. He blinked rapidly, his bloodshot eyes darting across the sharp, immaculate lines of Isaiah's bespoke suit. You could physically see the gears grinding in Trent's head as he tried desperately to reconcile the man standing casually beside me with the elusive phantom billionaire whose shadow dictated the movements of global finance. Isaiah did not raise his voice. He did not have to. True power never shouts. You thought you were clever, Trent, Isaiah said, his tone carrying the cold, sterile finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. You thought funneling client capital through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands would bury the paper trail. You assumed my auditors would simply write off the discrepancies as market volatility. But you did not just embezzle from your private clients, you embezzled from my firm. You siphoned Vanguard Capital to finance your syndicate and subsidize your wife's shopping sprees. Trent's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The aggressive swagger that had carried him into the VIP lounge evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. He looked instinctively toward Elias, seeking the protective shield of his father-in-law, but Elias was backed against the wall, hyperventilating. "No," Trent stammered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is impossible. I am protected. I told you I hired Aegis Consulting. I just wired them a $200,000 retainer from my clean accounts. They are already scrubbing my digital footprint. They are going to spin this. They are going to crush you." Isaiah looked at Trent with a level of absolute, unadulterated disgust. It was the look a person reserves for a cockroach right before stepping on it. "You really do not do your due diligence, do you?" Isaiah murmured. He took a single step back and gestured gracefully toward me, his dark eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "Trent, allow me to introduce you to the founder and CEO of Aegis Consulting." I stepped forward. The silence in the room was so profound, I could hear the faint, rapid ticking of Trent's gold Rolex. I looked down at the man who had spent the last 5 years treating me like an inconvenient peasant. I offered him a bright, razor-sharp smile. "Thank you for the retainer, Trent," I said, my voice smooth and conversational. "The funds cleared our corporate accounts exactly 4 minutes ago. However, as the CEO of Aegis, I must formally inform you that we are declining your representation due to a massive conflict of interest. As per the terms of service you blindly signed while sitting in a holding cell, the deposit is entirely non-refundable." Trent's eyes widened to the size of saucers. His gaze dropped to my emerald gown, then back up to my face, as if seeing me for the very first time. "Did you honestly think I spent the last 10 years crying over this family?" I asked, stepping closer to him. "When my parents cut me off when they threw me out to protect their pristine image, I did not fade away. I built an empire. I built a firm that specializes in tearing apart men exactly like you. I own your narrative, Trent. I hold every single one of your financial secrets, your offshore routing numbers, and your encrypted client lists. I control your legal fate, and I am handing every single byte of that data directly to the international authorities." The realization hit Trent with the force of a freight train. His breath hitched, his eyes rolled back slightly, and then Trent's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the expensive Persian carpet like a marionette with its strings cut. The heavy thud of his body hitting the floor echoed through the lounge. He did not try to get up. He just knelt there, his hands gripping the sides of his head, letting out a low, guttural moan of absolute defeat. He was bankrupt. He was facing federal prison. And the very person he had hired to save him was the architect of his destruction. But the most spectacular reaction did not come from Trent. It came from Jasmine. The moment Trent hit the floor, Jasmine shrieked. It was not a cry of concern for her husband. It was pure, unadulterated panic for herself. Her survival instincts, honed by decades of gold digging and status climbing, kicked in with terrifying speed. She physically recoiled from Trent, scrambling backward on the tufted velvet chaise lounge as if he were suddenly radioactive. She pulled her couture gown tightly around her legs, staring down at the man she had married with absolute repulsion. "I did not know!" Jasmine screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the horrified socialites and church elders. "I swear I had no idea he was broke. He lied to me. He told me he was wealthy. I am a victim here." Trent looked up at her from the floor, his face pale and streaked with sweat. "Jasmine," he rasped, reaching a shaking hand out toward her. "Jasmine, please." "Do not touch me!" she shrieked, kicking her heel out to swat his hand away. "You are a fraud! You are a criminal! You ruined my life! She scrambled off the chaise lounge and sprinted across the room, throwing herself violently at Valerie and Elias. She grabbed our father by the lapels of his suit, shaking him with a manic, terrifying strength. "Mom! Dad! You have to help me!" Jasmine sobbed, her manicured nails digging into his jacket. "You have to fix this. Trent is going to prison. The government is going to seize my accounts. They are going to take my house. They are going to take my jewelry. You have to save me." Elias stared at his favorite daughter, completely paralyzed. "Liquidate the church assets." Jasmine demanded, her voice reaching a hysterical, demanding pitch that made Elder Thomas physically step backward in horror. "Sell the parsonage. Empty the community tithing funds. I do not care what you have to do. You have to save my lifestyle. You promised me I would never have to struggle. You promised me I would always be taken care of. Pay them off. Pay Vanguard off." The room erupted into absolute chaos. The elite socialites who had spent years kissing the ground Jasmine walked on began whispering frantically, pulling their designer wraps tight and edging toward the door, desperate to escape the blast radius of the family's total collapse. Elder Thomas stepped forward, his face contorted in absolute fury. "Sell the church assets to fund your vanity," he roared, slamming his cane against the floor. "You would steal from the congregation to maintain your luxury. You are all corrupt. This entire family is rotten to its very core." Valerie burst into loud, humiliating tears, sinking against the wall as she realized the women she had spent decades trying to impress were looking at her like trash. Elias was shaking his head, his mouth opening and closing, as he stared at his frantic, demanding daughter and the elders who were now openly turning against him. I stood next to Isaiah, watching the empire of lies crumble into dust. They were turning on each other, tearing themselves apart for a scrap of survival. And the best part was, I had not even delivered the final blow. The frantic whispers of the fleeing socialites and the disgusted murmurs of the church elders faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. Elias stood in the center of the devastated VIP lounge, his chest heaving as he stared at the absolute wreckage of his dynasty. Trent was still a crumpled, hyperventilating mess on the Persian rug. Jasmine was clutching her father's arm, her perfectly contoured face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She was weeping openly, begging him to fix a problem that was fundamentally unfixable. Elias looked around the room, watching his elite congregation back away from him. His eyes darted to Isaiah, who stood beside me, with the relaxed, terrifying posture of a predator, entirely in control of its territory. Then Elias looked at me. He saw the cold, unapologetic victory in my posture, and it ignited the last desperate embers of his monumental pride. He could not let it end this way. He was Elias Vance. He was the shepherd of a megachurch, a man who commanded thousands, a man who built his entire existence on projecting an aura of divine prosperity. He straightened his spine, physically shielding Jasmine with his body. He kicked Trent's leg away in disgust, completely abandoning the son-in-law he had championed just 10 minutes prior. "Do not shed another tear," Jasmine Elias commanded, his voice vibrating with a sudden, desperate surge of arrogant authority. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit, lifting his chin as he delivered his final, pathetic sermon. "We are the Vance family. We do not beg. We do not cower in the face of demonic attacks, and we certainly do not rely on the charity of a bitter, vindictive child who has lost her way." He pointed a rigid, trembling finger at me, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "You think you have won because you sit in an ivory tower built on secular money?" Elias spat, his voice booming through the lounge. "You think you can break us? You are wrong. I am the head of this family. I will liquidate our assets. I will drain my personal accounts. I will save my daughter's marriage and her reputation, and we will wipe this entire embarrassment from the public record. We do not need your tainted money, Camille. We do not need you." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I just looked at him with an overwhelming sense of clinical pity. I reached down and unclasped the brass lock of my structured leather tote. The soft click echoed sharply in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was packed tight, bulging with stamped financial records, certified bank statements, and notarized offshore ledgers. I held it up for a fraction of a second, letting him see the bright red, highly confidential wax seal of the Monaco Financial Authority stamped across the flap. Then I dropped it flat onto the heavy glass coffee table between us. The sharp, heavy smack of the folder hitting the glass sounded like a gunshot. "You cannot liquidate anything, Dad," I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion, hollow and absolute. Elias stared at the folder. His hand, still pointing at me slowly, began to lower. "What is this?" he demanded, a tremor finally cracking his booming voice. "What lies have you manufactured now?" I stepped forward, tapping the cover of the folder with a single manicured fingernail. "You are a man who loves to preach about reaping what you sow," I stated calmly, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. "So let us look at the harvest. When Trent first pitched his offshore syndicate to you, he needed an anchor investor. He needed capital to make his fraudulent shell company look legitimate to the European markets. But Trent did not have the capital, did he? So you gave it to him." "That was an investment," Elias shouted, sweat breaking out across his upper lip. "It was a secure, high-yield portfolio designed to benefit our family trust." "It was a Ponzi scheme," I corrected him, my voice slicing through his denial like a scalpel. "And you were so blinded by greed, so desperate to multiply your wealth and secure Jasmine's elite lifestyle that you bypassed your own financial advisors. You leveraged everything. Every single asset you control is legally tied to Trent's toxic syndicate." Valerie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She grabbed the back of a velvet armchair, her knuckles turning white. "Elias," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "Elias, what is she talking about?" I did not let him answer. I turned my gaze directly to my mother. "He leveraged the Beacon Hill mansion, Mom," I told her, watching the color completely drain from her face. "He took out a massive second mortgage on the house you spent $2 million renovating. He leveraged the luxury cars. He liquidated your joint retirement portfolios. And the most spectacular part of his divine investment strategy," I turned back to Elias, watching his chest rise and fall in rapid, shallow jerks. "You took the $50 million megachurch expansion fund," I said, my voice ringing out clearly for the remaining church elders to hear. "The funds raised by your loyal working-class congregation. The money meant to build the new community center. You funneled all $50 million into Trent's offshore accounts through a blind trust, assuming you could double it, and quietly put the principal back before the board of directors ever noticed an audit." Elder Thomas let out a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. He dropped his cane, the wooden stick clattering loudly against the floor. "You stole from the church," Thomas rasped, clutching his chest. "You stole from the congregation." Elias was hyperventilating now. He took a stumbling step backward, shaking his head side to side. "It was a bridge loan," Elias babbled, his eyes darting around the room, seeking a sympathetic face and finding none. "Trent promised a guaranteed return. I was going to bless the church with the profits. I was going to multiply the loaves and fishes." "The loaves are gone, Dad," I said coldly. "Vanguard Capital just froze every single account associated with Trent's syndicate. The international authorities have already seized the offshore ledgers. Trent's assets are zero, which means your assets are zero. The bank will foreclose on the mansion by Friday. The church board will formally indict you for embezzlement the second I hand them this folder. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the entire facade. It is all gone. You are completely, irreversibly bankrupt." Valerie let out a piercing, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman realizing her entire identity had just been incinerated. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, her designer dress pooling around her as she grabbed her hair, sobbing hysterically into the carpet. Her elite friends, the country club socialites she had prized over her own daughter, simply stared at her with cold, merciless judgment. Jasmine stood frozen, her mouth open in a silent scream of absolute devastation. She looked at her father, then at her mother crying on the floor, and finally at Trent, who was still paralyzed in a state of shock. The lavish, protected bubble they had spent their entire lives cultivating had burst. I looked at the three of them, feeling no joy, no sadness, just a profound, overwhelming sense of finality. The war was over. Suddenly, a sharp, urgent vibration broke the silence. My phone buzzed in the palm of my hand. I slowly lifted the device, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light of the lounge. It was a secure, encrypted text message. The sender ID simply read, "Interpol Operations Command." I read the 2 lines of text displayed on the screen, a slow, dark realization settling over my features. I looked up, locking eyes with Isaiah. The international authorities were no longer just looking at Trent. The net had just been thrown much wider. The heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge did not simply open this time. They were thrown wide with a sudden violent force that rattled the crystal sconces hanging on the walls. A team of 6 heavily armed Monaco tactical police officers flooded into the room, their black gear and completely unreadable expressions slicing through the remaining glamour of the suite. Right behind them walked 2 plainclothes agents in sharp-tailored suits, their badges visibly clipped to their belts. The few remaining socialites shrieked, pressing themselves flat against the velvet wallpaper, as if trying to blend into the upholstery. Elder Thomas took a stumbling step backward, clutching his silver-tipped cane like a shield. The ambient hum of the casino outside felt a million miles away. The air in the room became incredibly thin. The lead plainclothes agent, a tall man with sharp hawkish features and a thick French accent, stepped directly into the center of the room. He did not look at the terrified socialites. He did not look at the church elders. He locked his eyes onto the shattered remains of my family. Elias saw the badges and immediately went into survival mode. The man who had spent a lifetime demanding loyalty from his flock was suddenly desperate to sacrifice anyone to save his own skin. He physically stepped over Trent, who was still paralyzed on the Persian rug, and rushed toward the lead agent with his hands raised in a gesture of absolute surrender. "Officers, thank God you are here!" Elias boomed, forcing his voice into its deepest, most authoritative register. "This man on the floor, Trent, has committed massive corporate fraud. I am Pastor Elias Vance, a prominent American citizen. We had no idea what he was doing. We are the victims here. Please take him away before he causes my family any more distress." The lead agent stopped. He looked at Elias with eyes as cold and flat as a frozen lake. "Pastor Vance," the agent said, his thick accent clipping every consonant with brutal precision. "My name is Agent Moreau with Interpol Operations Command, and you are severely mistaken. You are not a victim tonight. You are a primary suspect." Moreau snapped his fingers. 2 tactical officers instantly stepped forward, grabbing Trent by his underarms and hauling him up from the floor. Trent was completely dead weight. His expensive Italian suit bunched up around his shoulders, his feet dragging across the carpet as they clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He did not fight. He did not speak. He just stared blankly at the floor, utterly broken by the realization that the CEO of the crisis firm he had hired to save him was standing right in front of him. Elias swallowed hard, his booming voice faltering. "A suspect," Elias stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward Isaiah. "There has been a misunderstanding. I am a spiritual leader. I have diplomatic ties." "There is no misunderstanding," Agent Moreau replied, pulling a sleek digital tablet from his jacket. "Camille Vance and Mr. Sterling provided my office with an unassailable forensic packet 20 minutes ago. We have the complete unencrypted ledgers of the Vanguard Capital embezzlement. We also have the high-definition security footage from Charles de Gaulle Airport." Moreau turned his steely gaze away from Elias and looked down at Valerie. My mother was still a crumpled heap of designer fabric on the floor, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Valerie Vance Moreau declared, his voice ringing through the silent room. "You are under arrest for international passport theft, identity fraud, and criminal conspiracy." 2 tactical officers stepped toward her. Valerie let out a piercing, hysterical shriek and scrambled backward, her expensive heels kicking wildly at the carpet. "Do not touch me," Valerie screamed, holding her hands up to protect her perfectly coiffed hair. "I am a VIP. I am a pastor's wife. You cannot arrest me for this. It was just a passport. She is my daughter. I was grounding her. I was just trying to teach her a lesson about respecting her family. You cannot put a mother in jail for disciplining her child." I stepped forward, looking down at the woman who had happily tried to trap me in a foreign country to protect a thief. "You crossed an international border with stolen federal documents to facilitate a multi-million-dollar corporate sabotage scheme." "Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely merciless, "that is not discipline. That is a federal felony. And Interpol does not care about your country club status. The officers grabbed Valerie by the arms, hauling her to her feet. She thrashed and wailed, the heavy steel cuffs clicking loudly as they locked around her wrists. The sound was sharp and incredibly final. Elias puffed up his chest, taking a threatening step toward the officers handling his wife. "You release her this instant," Elias roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You have no jurisdiction here. I demand to speak to the American consulate immediately." Agent Moreau smiled a very thin, very cold smile. "The American consulate is fully aware of this operation," Mr. Vance Moreau stated smoothly. "In fact, they are the ones who expedited the warrants. You knowingly wired $50 million of community church funds through a fraudulent shell company to aid a known fugitive. You attempted to launder international money to cover up corporate espionage." Moreau signaled the remaining officers. "Elias Vance, you are under arrest for international wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and conspiracy." "No." Elias shouted, physically fighting the two massive tactical officers who grabbed his arms. He thrashed wildly, his custom-tailored suit jacket tearing loudly at the shoulder seam. "This is illegal. I am a man of God. You cannot do this to me. Thomas." Elias locked his panicked, bloodshot eyes onto the senior church elder standing near the bar. "Thomas, call the church lawyers." Elias begged, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "Call the board of directors. Tell them to wire bail money immediately. Do not just stand there." Elder Thomas gripped his cane tightly. He looked at Elias with a mixture of absolute pity and profound disgust. "The church no longer has a lawyer," Elias Thomas said, his voice shaking with righteous anger. "You spent our legal retainer on your son-in-law's Ponzi scheme. You stole the community center fund to buy sports cars in silence. May God have mercy on your soul, Elias, because the law certainly will not." Elias went completely limp, the fight draining out of his body in a single devastating rush. The tactical officers forced his hands behind his back and locked the cuffs tightly over his wrists. Valerie, weeping uncontrollably, looked frantically across the room at Jasmine. "Jasmine." Valerie sobbed, straining against the officer holding her. "Jasmine, call the bank. Liquidate your trust fund. Call your father's wealthy friends. Do something. Save us." But Jasmine did exactly what her parents had spent 30 years teaching her to do. She saved herself. Jasmine physically pressed her back against the mahogany bar, recoiling from her handcuffed parents and her catatonic husband as if they were covered in flames. She shook her head rapidly, her eyes wide with selfish terror. "Do not look at me," Jasmine shrieked, raising her hands defensively in the air. "I had nothing to do with this. I just spent the money. I did not know where it came from. I did not sign anything. Leave me out of this. I'm not going to prison for you." Valerie gasped, a fresh wave of agonizing tears spilling down her face as her golden child publicly abandoned her. Elias hung his head, staring at the floor, completely broken by the very monster of entitlement he had created. Agent Moreau tipped his head respectfully toward Isaiah and me, then turned toward the door. "Get them out of here," Moreau ordered. I stood in the center of the room, my posture flawless, and watched as my mother, my father, and my brother-in-law were marched out of the VIP lounge in handcuffs. They were going to be paraded through the crowded, glittering lobby of the Monaco Casino in chains, exposed to the world not as elite socialites or righteous leaders, but as the fraudulent, desperate criminals they truly were. The cold, unyielding reality of the steel handcuffs locking around their wrists finally pierced the delusion my parents had wrapped themselves in for decades. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like gunshots in the VIP lounge. Until this exact second, Elias and Valerie Vance truly believed they could talk their way out of anything. They believed their country club memberships, their mega-church congregation, and their tailored suits granted them diplomatic immunity from the consequences of their own actions. But as the heavy-gloved hands of the tactical officers gripped their shoulders, forcing them toward the mahogany exit doors, the truth crashed down on them. Their wealth was an illusion, their lawyers were unfunded, their power was completely broken. The only person in the room who possessed the forensic data, the corporate authority, and the backing of a billionaire titan to stop this nightmare was the very daughter they had just tried to destroy. Elias dug his expensive leather heels into the Persian carpet, physically resisting the officers trying to march him out. He twisted his body around his chest, heaving his face slick with a frantic, terrified sweat. The arrogant patriarch who had just threatened to bury me in federal court was gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered animal willing to say absolutely anything to survive. "Camille, please!" Elias begged, his voice cracking loudly as he strained against the grip of the tactical police. "Camille, you must stop them. You have to tell them this is a terrible mistake. We are your parents. I am your father." I stood perfectly still beside Isaiah, my face an impenetrable mask of calm. I let his words hang in the silent room, exposing how incredibly hollow they sounded. "We made a mistake," Camille. Elias pleaded, his eyes wide and panicked as he tried to invoke the religion he had weaponized against me my entire life. "We are commanded to forgive. You know this. I am a man of faith. We were just trying to protect your sister. You know how fragile Jasmine is. You know she cannot handle hardship. We were just trying to keep the family together. We were doing what any loving parents would do. Tell this agent to release us. Tell him you withdraw the evidence." He was actually trying to gaslight me while wearing handcuffs. He was actively trying to reframe his international wire fraud, his embezzlement of church funds, and his willingness to let me rot in a foreign prison as an act of misguided parental love. He expected me to fall back into my designated role as the family scapegoat, the compliant daughter who would absorb their sins to preserve their pristine image. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply looked at him with a gaze so entirely devoid of sympathy that he physically flinched. The absolute zero of my emotional state conveyed a message louder than any scream. He had absolutely no leverage left. Seeing her husband fail, Valerie completely snapped. My mother, a woman who had spent her entire adult life obsessing over her public image, who judged everyone around her by their pedigree and their bank accounts, abandoned her last shred of dignity. She ignored the horrified stares of the elite socialites she had spent years trying to impress. She ignored her ruined makeup and her disheveled hair. Valerie dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled across the expensive Persian carpet, moving with a manic, desperate energy. The tactical officers tried to pull her back by her arms, but she fought them with the hysterical strength of a woman watching her life end. She scrambled toward me, her breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. She reached my feet. Her trembling, manicured hands shot out, grabbing the hem of my emerald couture gown. She gripped the heavy silk fabric as if it were the only life preserver on a sinking ship. She looked up at me from the floor, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. "Camille." My mother wept, her voice a frantic, breathless plea that echoed off the paneled walls. "Camille, my beautiful, strong, independent black woman. You are our blood. You are the smart one. You have the power to fix this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding." I looked down at the woman gripping my dress. The sheer audacity of her words was breathtaking. Beautiful, strong, independent black woman. Those were the exact traits Valerie had spent my entire life trying to suppress, critique, and erase. She had always wanted a compliant, quiet accessory. She had treated my independence as a character flaw, my strength as an inconvenience, and my intelligence as a threat to Jasmine's fragile ego. She had abandoned me to the authorities at Charles de Gaulle without a second thought, completely willing to sacrifice my freedom to protect a thief. And now, when her survival depended on the very strength she had tried to destroy, she was weaponizing my identity. She was adopting whatever vocabulary she thought would manipulate my emotions, attempting to play the role of a supportive, admiring mother to a daughter she had thrown to the wolves. It was the ultimate desperate act of a narcissist trapped in a corner with no exits remaining. I did not feel a surge of rage. I did not feel a sudden urge to cry for the mother I never truly had. Looking down at her pathetic, groveling form, I only felt a profound, liberating emptiness. The heavy, suffocating chains of family obligation that I had dragged around for 30 years simply dissolved into dust. "I am an independent black woman," I stated, my voice echoing through the silent room with the lethal, absolute chill of a winter storm. "And my first act of independence is letting you rot." Without breaking eye contact, I effortlessly pulled my emerald gown from her desperate grip. The silk slipped through her trembling fingers, leaving her grasping at empty air. Valerie let out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a wounded howl. The tactical officers immediately seized the opportunity, gripping her firmly under the arms and hauling her forcefully to her feet. She kicked and thrashed her wails, echoing against the crystal sconces, but her resistance was entirely futile. "Take them away!" Agent Moreau commanded, his voice slicing through her hysterics. The heavy mahogany doors were pulled wide. The tactical team marched my parents and my brother-in-law out of the VIP lounge. Elias was sobbing openly, his head bowed in absolute disgrace. Trent was dragging his feet, a hollow shell of a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. And Valerie was screaming my name, her cries growing fainter and more pathetic as they were paraded down the hallway and into the crowded, glittering lobby of the Monaco Casino. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the heavy doors click shut, sealing their fate permanently. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the clean, unburdened air fill my lungs for the very first time in my life. Agent Moreau had not followed the tactical team out into the corridor just yet. He stood near the entrance of the VIP lounge, his sharp eyes surveying the scattered, luxurious wreckage of the Vance dynasty's false empire. I walked back to the heavy glass coffee table, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The thick manila folder, bulging with the unassailable proof of their destruction, still sat exactly where I had dropped it. I picked it up, feeling the incredibly satisfying weight of justice resting in the palms of my hands. I walked over to the lead Interpol agent and held the physical evidence binder out to him. Moreau took it, slipping the heavy file under his arm with a rigid, respectful nod. He assured me the international asset freeze was already in full effect, and that Vanguard Capital's recovery team would be seizing control of the offshore accounts by dawn. He turned on his heel and exited, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind him. A pathetic, wet, gasping sound broke the sudden quiet of the room. Jasmine was still pressed flat against the mahogany bar. As the reality of her total bankruptcy finally registered, her legs gave out completely. She slid down the polished wood, collapsing into a heap on the floor. As she fell, her custom $20,000 silk gown caught on the sharp, broken edge of a shattered champagne flute. The delicate fabric tore with a loud rip, slicing a jagged, ugly line straight up the designer bodice. She did not look at the doorway where her husband and parents had just been dragged away to face federal prison. Instead, she grabbed the torn fabric of her dress, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure, selfish horror. "My aesthetic is ruined!" Jasmine screamed, beating her fists wildly against the Persian rug. The entire wedding spread was going to Vogue. "My brand is dead. I have 0 brand deals left. How am I supposed to post this?" She was sobbing hysterically, completely unhinged, mourning the death of her social media presence while her family faced decades behind bars. She shrieked that her followers would abandon her, that her luxury sponsors would drop her, and that her entire curated lifestyle had been stolen. The remaining church elders and the few lingering Monaco socialites did not offer her a single word of comfort. They simply stepped around her, averting their eyes, as if she were a piece of discarded trash. They were eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Vance name. Jasmine was utterly ignored by everyone in the room, rendered completely invisible the exact moment her bank account hit 0. I turned my back on her tantrums and walked through the side doors, stepping out onto the sweeping marble balcony that overlooked the resort's grand hall. Isaiah stepped up right beside me, a silent, immovable pillar of strength. Below us, the true finale was playing out. The Monaco Tactical Police were not gentle. They marched Trent, Elias, and Valerie straight through the center of the crowded casino floor. The dazzling crystal chandeliers illuminated every brutal, humiliating detail of their downfall. The grand hall was packed with high rollers, resort staff, and the very same elite socialites who had been toasting Valerie's elegance less than an hour ago. Elias was practically being dragged, his torn custom suit jacket hung off his shoulders, his booming, authoritative voice reduced to a pathetic, breathless whimpering. He tried to hide his face from the hundreds of onlookers, but the tactical officers kept his head forced up, marching him past the high-stakes tables and the stunned, staring crowds. The shepherd of the megachurch was finally being exposed to the flock as a ravenous wolf. Valerie was putting up a violent, undignified fight. She twisted and kicked her diamond necklaces, catching the harsh light as she shrieked at the resort concierges to do something. She demanded they call the manager. She demanded they respect her VIP status. The staff simply stood back and watched in horrified, fascinated silence. Many patrons held up their phones, recording the spectacular public collapse of the righteous Pastor Vance and his elite wife. Trent was completely unresponsive. He was a hollow shell shuffling forward in heavy steel handcuffs, staring blankly at the marble floor, as the reality of his ruined life finally crushed the last breath from his lungs. The flashing blue and red lights of the Interpol cruisers waiting outside spilled through the massive glass entrance doors, painting the grand hall in the unforgiving colors of justice. I stood at the top of the balcony, resting my hands on the cool marble railing, and watched the officers shove my family through the revolving doors. The heavy glass sealed shut behind them. The frantic, pathetic screaming of my mother and the desperate sobbing of my father were instantly cut off, swallowed completely by the Monaco night. The casino floor immediately erupted into a deafening wave of whispers, gossip, and shocked murmurs. But up on the balcony, everything felt perfectly, beautifully still. I looked down at my hands. They were not shaking. I felt no lingering guilt, no residual fear, no ingrained obligation to fix the monumental mess they had made. The toxic, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest since childhood was entirely gone. I had not just survived the fire they tried to burn me in. I had redirected the flames, and I had watched their entire fraudulent empire burn down to the absolute foundations. I turned to Isaiah. He was already looking at me, his dark eyes reflecting the quiet, absolute victory of the night. He did not offer any meaningless platitudes or unnecessary congratulations. He understood exactly what this moment meant. He simply offered me his arm. I smoothed the flawless emerald silk of my couture gown, adjusting my posture until my spine was perfectly straight. I rested my hand lightly on his forearm, feeling the solid, reassuring strength beneath the dark fabric of his suit. "Shall we?" I asked, my voice smooth, light, and entirely free. We walked away from the balcony, moving with a synchronized, unhurried grace. We did not look back at the VIP lounge where Jasmine was still crying over her ruined dress. We did not look down at the casino floor where the remains of my family's reputation were being dissected by strangers. We walked out of the grand hall together, the sound of the past fading into nothingness behind the heavy oak doors, leaving the ashes of the Vance dynasty exactly where they belonged. 6 months later, the humid, chaotic heat of Monaco had been entirely replaced by the crisp, biting wind of a Manhattan autumn. I sat behind a massive, custom-carved obsidian desk, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my penthouse office. This was the global headquarters of Aegis Consulting, the international crisis management firm Isaiah and I had built from the ground up. It was a space designed to project absolute, unyielding power. The floors were polished dark oak, the furniture was minimalist and sharp, and the ambient silence was a testament to the fact that we controlled the narrative of the world's most elite corporations. The frantic, pathetic screaming of my family in that casino lobby felt like a lifetime ago. It was a closed chapter, a closed book, a closed library. Behind me, embedded seamlessly into the dark walnut paneling of the wall, a sleek flat-screen monitor was quietly broadcasting the midday news. I typically kept it muted, a constant stream of global financial data and corporate updates scrolling in the background. But as a familiar photograph flashed across the high-definition screen, I reached for the silver remote on my desk and pressed the volume button. The anchor's voice was crisp, professional, and entirely devoid of sympathy as she delivered the latest update on the scandal of the decade. The segment was titled, "The Vance Dynasty Collapse 6 Months Later." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, steepling my fingers together as I watched the meticulous dissection of my family's ruin. First came Trent. The broadcast displayed a recent courtroom sketch of my former brother-in-law. The smug, untouchable finance bro who used to lecture me on leverage and capital had been utterly erased. He was depicted standing before a federal judge stripped of his custom-tailored Italian suits and his Rolex watches wearing standard-issue federal prison khaki. The Vanguard Capital embezzlement case had been an absolute bloodbath for the defense. Because Isaiah and I had handed Interpol and the SEC the unencrypted offshore ledgers, Trent had absolutely no room to negotiate a plea deal. The anchor announced with clinical precision that Trent Sterling had been sentenced to 10 years in a medium-security federal penitentiary. His offshore syndicate had been entirely dismantled, his assets completely liquidated to pay back the investors he had defrauded. He was currently serving his time scrubbing cafeteria trays, his name reduced to a cautionary tale taught in corporate ethics seminars. Then the broadcast shifted to the main event. A split screen appeared showing a photograph of Elias and Valerie Vance in their prime standing in front of their massive megachurch, juxtaposed against a grainy recent photograph of them walking down a dirty, rain-slicked sidewalk. The megachurch board of directors had not hesitated. The morning after Interpol marched Elias out of the Monaco casino in handcuffs, the board convened an emergency session. They unanimously voted to strip Elias of his pastoral leadership, his pension, and his severance package. They publicly excommunicated him, releasing a scathing press release, condemning his fraudulent diversion of the $50 million community center fund. Without the church's protection, and with all of their personal assets frozen by international authorities, the bank foreclosed on the Beacon Hill mansion within 30 days. Valerie's extensive collection of designer jewelry, her luxury cars, and her country club memberships were seized and auctioned off to cover their mounting legal debts. The news anchor reported that Elias and Valerie Vance were now residing in a tiny rundown 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of South Boston. The broadcast showed a brief clip of the neighborhood. It was a gritty industrial block bordered by a noisy laundromat and a discount auto parts store. It was the exact type of working-class, blue-collar neighborhood that Valerie used to openly mock at her elite charity galas, calling it spiritually bankrupt and aesthetically offensive. Now she was forced to carry her own groceries up 4 flights of peeling, unlit stairs, hiding her face behind cheap sunglasses to avoid the pitying stares of the neighbors. Finally, the screen transitioned to a photograph that had recently gone viral on social media. It was Jasmine, my golden sister, the pampered princess who had never worked a single day in her life, had been utterly abandoned by Trent the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. Stripped of her trust fund, her black cards, and her husband's fraudulent wealth, Jasmine had attempted to seek refuge with her high society friends. She had called the influencers the socialites and the boutique owners she had cultivated for years. Every single one of them had blocked her number. In the ruthless world of extreme wealth, poverty was considered a contagious disease, and Jasmine was radioactive. The viral photograph on the screen showed Jasmine standing behind the cash register of a brightly lit discount makeup store in a suburban strip mall. She was wearing a stiff, unflattering polyester uniform polo shirt. Her perfectly contoured face was pale and exhausted under the harsh fluorescent lighting. She was holding a barcode scanner, ringing up a basket of cheap lip gloss for a teenage customer. The caption beneath the photo read, "From couture to clearance, the fall of a socialite." She was no longer an elite influencer. She was a minimum wage cashier forced to clock in for 8-hour shifts just to afford basic necessities. Her precious aesthetic was dead, completely incinerated by the reality of the working-class life she had spent her entire existence avoiding. I watched the screen for another 10 seconds, absorbing the absolute totality of their destruction. They had reaped exactly what they had sown. The harvest was barren, bitter, and entirely of their own making. I pressed the mute button on the remote, instantly cutting off the anchor's voice. The penthouse office returned to its serene, powerful silence. The heavy glass door of my office clicked open, and Isaiah stepped inside. He was wearing a charcoal gray bespoke suit that fit him flawlessly, holding a sleek digital tablet in his right hand. He looked at the muted television screen, then looked over at me, a knowing, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Are we dwelling on the past? Camille Isaiah asked, his deep voice, carrying a tone of dark amusement as he walked over to my desk. I picked up a gold-plated fountain pen, tapping it once against a thick stack of corporate acquisition contracts resting on my blotter. I looked at the muted television, then back up at the man who had helped me burn my abusers to the ground. Not at all, I replied, my voice steady, resonant, and overflowing with quiet authority. The past is exactly where it belongs. Let us talk about the future. Isaiah's deep chuckle vibrated through the quiet expanse of the penthouse. He tossed the digital tablet onto the polished obsidian desk, dismissing the final remnants of the Vance dynasty with a literal flick of his wrist. He did not walk toward the seating area. Instead, he moved smoothly toward the integrated wet bar concealed behind the dark walnut paneling. The future it is, then. Isaiah murmured his back to me as he opened a climate-controlled glass door. He reached inside and retrieved a bottle of vintage Armand de Brignac, the dark glass catching the ambient light of the office. Though I think securing the absolute surrender of Vanguard Capital's remaining European assets warrants a momentary pause for celebration. I watched him pour the pale, sparkling liquid into 2 crystal flutes. There was a time not so long ago when relying on anyone felt like a fatal liability. My mother had taught me that trust was just the preamble to abandonment. But looking at Isaiah now, I felt no hesitation, no lingering anxiety, no defensive walls. We had not bonded over shared trauma or a desperate toxic codependency. We had forged our partnership in the fires of corporate warfare and absolute mutual respect. We were equals. We were a monolith. Together we had weaponized the truth, and Aegis Consulting was the unstoppable thriving result. Isaiah walked back to the desk, handing me one of the flutes. Our fingers brushed a brief, electrifying spark of connection that grounded me perfectly in the present. To the future, Isaiah said, raising his glass slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine. And to the complete acquisition of the Vanguard portfolio. We bought the remaining shares for pennies on the dollar this morning. The European board practically begged us to take the liability off their hands. Trent's mess is officially our new foundation. They needed a savior, I replied, a slow, predatory smile touching my lips. And we were happy to oblige. Aegis Consulting just doubled its international footprint before lunch. We did not just tear down their house, Isaiah. We bought the land it was built on. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, the silk of my tailored suit brushing softly against the desk. I stepped out from behind the imposing obsidian barrier and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a brilliant, fiery glow over the Manhattan skyline. Millions of lights were flickering to life across the city, a sprawling grid of power, ambition, and endless possibility. This city belonged to us now. The skyscrapers stretching into the clouds were no longer intimidating. They were merely reflections of the heights we had already conquered. I took a slow sip of the rare champagne, letting the crisp, complex flavor settle the reality of this moment into my bones. I felt no lingering shadows of the girl who used to shrink under Valerie's cruel critiques. I felt no ghost of the daughter who had desperately sought Elias's validation, twisting herself into knots to fit their impossible, hypocritical standards. The trauma had not just been conquered, it had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a titanium core of absolute self-assurance. There was no grief for the family I had lost, because I finally understood that I had never truly had them to begin with. Isaiah stepped up beside me, his shoulder brushing mine as we looked out over the glittering metropolis. He did not need to ask what I was thinking. The silence between us was rich, communicative, and completely secure. He was my partner in every conceivable sense of the word, the only person who matched my drive and respected my ruthlessness. They thought they held all the cards. I said quietly, the crystal glass cool against my palm. For 30 years, Elias and Valerie operated under the delusion that they were the undisputed architects of my reality. They believed their wealth shielded them from accountability, and they believed my loyalty was a permanent, exploitable resource that they could drain without consequence. I took another sip, my eyes tracking the steady flow of traffic far below, watching the tiny headlights bleed into rivers of gold. But they failed to understand the basic mechanics of a fire. I continued, my voice steady, ringing with an unshakable conviction. When you strip someone of everything, when you burn down their sanctuary, and leave them with absolutely nothing to lose, you do not destroy them. You forge them into something completely fireproof. Isaiah turned his head, looking at my profile. His gaze reflected the fierce, unapologetic pride he held for me. You didn't just expose them, Camille. You gave them exactly what they spent a lifetime worshipping. You gave them a mirror. You forced them to look at their own reflection. I gave them a harvest, I corrected smoothly, turning to face him. My mother loved to preach about the aesthetics of prosperity. My father loved to preach about divine consequence. I simply facilitated the audit. They spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was fundamentally unworthy of taking up space in their pristine world. They tried to break me down into a manageable, quiet accessory, a scapegoat they could discard the second I became inconvenient. I looked back out at the glowing skyline, feeling the immense, untouchable weight of my own success. I had orchestrated their ultimate lesson, dismantling their corruption with surgical precision, leaving no stone unturned and no account unfrozen. The core lesson of this story is that true power does not come from inherited wealth, social manipulation, or a carefully curated public image. It comes from unyielding integrity, self-reliance, and the courage to sever toxic ties even when they involve your own blood. Camille's journey illustrates that enduring years of silent abuse can forge an unbreakable spirit. When you refuse to absorb the sins of a narcissistic family and instead choose to meticulously orchestrate your own independence, you reclaim your narrative. Justice is best served not with loud anger, but with cold, undeniable truth. If you found Camille's journey to ultimate vindication empowering, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of triumphant revenge.